Okay, in this screencast, we're going to talk about what scientists have found over the years that seems to support the theory of evolution. Okay, the first and probably most common example of evidence for evolution is called homologous structures. Remember that the prefix homo means same. Homologous structures are features that are similar in different organisms that might just indicate a common ancestor. If you look at the bones in the arms of these four animals, you notice that all of them have a single humerus in the upper part of the arm, but then two bones in the lower part of the arm, the radius and the ulna, and then phalanges. That's not that surprising when you see a human or an alligator, but when you look at the bat and the penguin, it is quite surprising that they have the same bone structure, even though their limbs are so dramatically different than ours. What does that mean? It's not that penguins came from humans or anything like that. It's that all four organisms appear to have had a common ancestor that had a single humerus in the top of the arm and two bones in the lower part of the arm, the radius and the ulna, and then phalanges. All of them seem to have had a common ancestor. Sometimes students like to consider similarities between humans and apes. In this particular comparison, we're actually looking at a gorilla and sort of a pre-human called an Australopithecine. If you see, they have a lot of homologous structures, a lot of things in common, skull and pelvis and the arms, et cetera, et cetera. The one thing that I like to point out to people is the difference between an Australopithecine and a Homo sapien, which is what a modern human is. The skull is perhaps the biggest indicator of the difference. Notice that the top of the skull is flattened. It is the front of our skull that holds where they believe most of our critical thinking occurs in our brain. So the front of our skull sort of pushes forward over the eyebrows, whereas his skull is flat at the eyebrows. He also has a much larger jaw, apparently for chewing food that's more difficult to chew than what we chew currently, and our jaws are fairly small. Okay, now analogous structures kind of don't fit in this particular presentation because they're actually structures that look like they indicate evolution, or I'm sorry, that they indicate a common ancestor, but in fact they don't indicate a common recent ancestor. One example is the wings of a bird and the wings of a butterfly. Structurally, the wings are so dramatically different. If you dissect a bird wing and dissect an insect wing, they clearly have nothing in common. So even though they're both wings, we call them analogous structures. They do not indicate close ancestry. Another, maybe even better example is the fin on a shark and the fin on a dolphin. They look so similar, and for years and years we thought dolphins and sharks were closely related. But when you dissect the fin of a shark and dissect the fin of a dolphin, you find that the fin of a shark is just made of cartilage, whereas the fin of a dolphin actually has some of those homologous bones we were just looking at a few moments ago. So the structure is very different. Of course, we now understand that dolphins are mammals and that sharks are fish, and that they're not closely related. They haven't had a close recent ancestor. Okay, vestigial structures are one that students are often fascinated with. These are features that apparently have no purpose currently, but may have been useful to an ancestor. The first example is the example that's in blue. That's a tailbone, a human tailbone. Why humans have a tailbone isn't always clear. It indicates perhaps that the ancestors of humans had a tail. The whale up above has bones near its tail that appear to be pelvis bones. Pelvis bones are specifically hip bones that hold back legs, but the whale obviously doesn't have back legs. Well, we believe, scientists believe, that whales evolved from mammals that were once walked on land, and they were four-legged animals. And over time, there were mutations that caused those hind legs to disappear, but the pelvis is still there as evidence of those hind legs that were there at one time. And similarly, the picture on the bottom is of a snake, and inside the snake's skin there are actually leg bones that indicate that at one time the ancestors of snakes had legs, but mutations over time caused those legs to mostly disappear. Now they're just embedded within the snake's body. Now remember that in Darwin's day they didn't know what DNA was. Now they know what DNA is, and so scientists more recently have been using DNA to determine evolutionary relationships. What they've figured is that the more closely related organisms are, the more similar their DNA must be. So for example, on the diagram, the human and the macaque are very similar in terms of their amino acids and in terms of their DNA, whereas a human and a lamprey are much farther apart in terms of their DNA, and so they're considered less closely related. Similarly, scientists have been using something called molecular clocks. Again, they're looking at the number of mutations or the number of differences between organisms in terms of their A's, T's, C's, and G's, their nucleotides. What they've figured out is that genes appear to mutate at a relatively constant rate. And so what it says here, I'll read the quote, the longer the time since the organisms diverged, the greater the number of differences in the nucleotide sequences. So scientists can kind of calculate how far apart, how many mutations separate, say, a human from a kangaroo or a human from a cow. And then they can use that separation to calculate how long ago they separated on the tree of life. Okay, there's a few patterns of evolution that we want to mention. The first one's called convergent evolution. This is somewhat of a tricky one. This is when the environment selects similar features, even though the ancestors themselves are quite different. So we mentioned earlier the porpoise or the dolphin and the shark, and we said they're not closely related, even though they look a lot alike. And we said analogous structures were like their fins, used to trick scientists or used to trick people into thinking that they were closely related. Now we understand that the reason they look so much alike is because their environment chooses certain traits. It is more beneficial to not have fur in water. So despite the fact that dolphins or porpoises are mammals, they no longer have an abundance of fur because that mutation that takes away their fur makes them better swimmers. So the environment is selecting characteristics that make them look alike, make porpoises look like sharks, even though they are not closely related. The opposite of convergent evolution is divergent evolution. I need to maybe explain the two words. To converge on something means to come together. So imagine two very different species that look very different coming together to live in the same environment and eventually starting to look like one another. That was what convergent evolution was on the previous slide. Now this is the exact opposite. You start out with one species who moves maybe to different environments. Maybe some, in this case, we'll use the birds. These are Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. Some of them move to large islands where large seeds are available. Some of them move to other islands where insects are available as a food source. Some of them move to other areas of the islands where maybe grass seeds or tiny seeds are available. In those different environments, different sized beaks are preferable, and so the individuals that are born with a sized beak that's best for that environment, those are the ones that are going to go on and have the most babies. So divergent is when you start with one species and then they spread out into many different species. So again, convergent, you have different species that come together, they converge to look alike. Divergent is when they explode out. You start with one in the middle and they explode out to make lots of different varieties. All right, most students are familiar with the concept of artificial selection. This is when humans get involved. That's why it's called artificial. It's when humans deliberately select certain characteristics for breeding purposes. They want to produce certain species that are useful to us, maybe for agriculture, food production, transport, or even just as pets. They choose certain traits that they find preferable, and then they continue to breed only those individuals. Those traits might not be chosen, or probably wouldn't be chosen in the wild. For example, humans have chosen smallness genes in certain dog species to produce our smallest dogs, whereas smallness genes might not be preferable in many environments for real dogs, for dogs that live out in the wild. I didn't mean to say real dogs, dogs that live in the wild. And finally, this last pattern of evolution is called coevolution. It's kind of neat. Coevolution is when closely associated species evolve to work together. And there are many, many examples. This is just one of them, the acacia ants and the acacia trees. The acacia ants live on these acacia trees, and they feed on this tiny little golden orange packet that's on the tips of the leaves. That packet has food that the ants farm, and they carry to their offspring, and they help feed their young. What's great about this relationship is the acacia tree is feeding the ants, but in return, the ants protect the tree. If any animal, an herbivore, comes along and attempts to eat the acacia tree, the ants attack. They bite the herbivore so that the herbivore will leave, won't keep eating the plant. And so they've evolved this relationship where the two are helping each other, and that's called coevolution. That's it for today.